Good morning, and welcome again to Coffee with Mr. V. As ever, I'll click the button, and now I'm struggling to just line up the whiteboard so that you guys don't have a huge amount of glare. I think that's probably as good as it's going to get. So today I just want to talk about output gaps, and in particular I want to talk about output gaps in the Keynesian world compared to output gaps in the classical or neoclassical or monetarist world. Okay, as ever in Coffee with Mr. V, everything just went blank there for a second. Right, I think you're still with me, okay? As ever with Coffee with Mr. V, make sure you've got a coffee, or if you don't like coffee, whatever your favorite liquid is, put it in a mug, a glass, or a cup. And then with me, let's do the synchronized sip, and we'll get this show on the road. You gotta love coffee. So most of our analysis throughout the 2 years that I teach you is with the Keynesian model. That's because I think it's the most intuitive model. Okay, and with the Keynesian model then, an output gap is simply the difference between the intersection with AD and AS, which we would call Y1, and the vertical point of the AS curve, which we would call YFE, Y at full employment, okay? Remember, the vertical part of the Keynesian AS curve is meant to reflect the PPF, the point at which we have run out of resources. Okay, demand has increased to the point where there is so much demand for resources that we have run out, we've hit the edge of the PPF, and we simply cannot produce any more output, okay? And therefore, that's why it's vertical, because any increase in demand up here would simply lead to an increase in the price level and no more output. We have hit the output. So we in Keynesian terms, we talk about this output gap here, the gap between YFE and Y1. That is known as an output gap. If you want to think about it in terms of the PPF, we are within the PPF. Okay, we are not productively efficient. We have some scarce resource. We have some unemployed resources. It might be labor, so this might be cyclical unemployment. There's not enough demand to employ all the people who are willing and able to work, who are part of the labor force. Or it might just mean that not all of the land is being fully utilized, or it might be that not all of the capital is being fully utilized. So we are within the PPF. As aggregate demand increases, for whatever reason that might be, maybe it's an increase in consumption, maybe the trade balance has improved for some reason. As aggregate demand shifts to the right, Y1 goes to Y2, and that output gap gets smaller. All right, we get closer to the PPF. The PPF hasn't moved. The PPF, remember, is the vertical point of the AS curve, okay? But we have got closer to the PPF. More of our resources are being utilized. We're getting closer to that point of full employment. Cyclical unemployment has fallen, okay? Because cyclical unemployment, for the second time, remember, is the unemployment that results from there being a lack of demand. Well, we've got more demand. It's still not quite got us to full capacity, but there is more demand. Therefore, there is more demand for labor, and therefore the output gap has fallen. This is known as a negative output gap, okay? Where we are within the PPF, where not all of our resources are being fully used, that is called a negative output gap. So in the Keynesian world, you can have a negative output gap, and critically, you can have a negative output gap going into the long run, because unlike classical economists, as we'll see in a moment, Keynes believed that actually you could be stuck there. You could be stuck at this point for a long time. Yeah, his famous quote, "In the long run, we're all dead." In the long run, unless, in Keynesian world again, unless you come in and you stimulate aggregate demand somehow, maybe an increase in government spending, AD will simply sit there and you will have unemployment for a long time, because there is no increase in aggregate demand that is simply going to happen for no reason other than if you artificially stimulate it. Okay, so that's one of our key conclusions here with output gaps. In the Keynesian world, you can have a negative output gap in the long run. There is no sense in which you can have a positive output gap in Keynesian economics, because once AD gets to that vertical point of his AS curve, then you are at YFE. You are now on the PPF. You are at full employment. Everybody who wants a job has a job. There is no cyclical unemployment anymore. So you've reached the PPF. But that's not a positive output gap. That just means you've hit full capacity. You have hit YFE. So in the Keynesian world, there is no such thing as a positive output gap. Right, let's bring that into our classical understanding of the world, okay? So in classical economics, where you've got the upward sloping short run aggregate supply curve and the aggregate demand curve, that intersection is at YFE, all right? That's based on the premise that everybody who is willing and able to take a job has a job. There is enough demand for those people. So we are already at YFE. Now let's bring ourselves into that situation then, where aggregate demand falls for some reason. It may be, well, it's clearly a recession. There is negative growth, but that may have been caused by something like a fall in consumption, a fall in investment, a worsening of the trade balance. For whatever reason, any of those components of AD may have fallen, and that has caused a small recession. It's also caused, therefore, a small output gap, a negative output gap. We have moved from being on the PPF to inside the PPF. We now have an output gap, a negative output gap. But let's remind ourselves of the classical story. The classical story goes, if aggregate demand falls, that means the demand for goods and services fall. That means the demand for labor falls. Well, cyclical unemployment. Yeah, that kind of makes sense so far. Again, no difference yet with anything that Keynes says. The difference, though, happens here. In a classical world, that means that wages should fall. Okay, the reason that wages fall is in the labor market. If the demand for labor falls, that will bring wages downwards from W1 to W2. Okay. Keynes, remember, didn't agree with that, by the way. Keynes said that wages were sticky downwards. Keynes said that people wouldn't just happily renegotiate their net wages downwards. And bringing it into kind of this idea of being modern day in 2020, there are things like trade unions, there are things like minimum wages, there are things like long-term employment contracts in which you can't just break them. There are unemployment benefits. Why would somebody accept a wage decrease when they could just voluntarily take themselves out of the labor force and collect unemployment benefit? So there are all sorts of reasons why this might not happen today in 2020 either. But in the classical world, wages would fall, costs of production fall, and when costs of production fall, you should shift the AS curve, the short-run aggregate supply curve, to the right. So SRAS1 becomes SRAS2, and we self-stabilize back at YFE. So we have gone from A to B and back to C. We're back at the PPF. So classical economists agreed that you could have a negative output gap, but only in the short run. Because in the long run, what would happen is that the SRAS curve would move in order to counter any effect with AD. And although that you would be at a slightly different price level, back on the x-axis, you'd come back to the GDP, real GDP at full employment. So for a classical economist, negative output gaps exist, but only in the short run and not in the long run. Let's have a look at that with then a positive output gap. So I'm going to redraw my classical diagram. So this time then, here's AD, here's SRAS, and here is YFE. We're back on the PPF. And now let's have an increase in aggregate demand, an increase in consumption. Well, that takes us to Y1. That takes us to a point outside of the PPF. So now I'm going to completely come back to your week one economics learning about the PPFs and tell you that actually, for a small period of time, you can produce outside of the PPF. And that's sometimes a little bit difficult to take for some students because PPF kind of makes sense. Yeah, it's a diagram that really does make sense. The boundary is when you've run out of resources. So how can you produce outside of your resources? The theory to some extent is a little bit fudged here. What it's saying is that for a small period of time, that actually you can produce outside of your PPF. Now, really what's happening is it's really like saying that the PPF for a temporary period of time is shifting outwards. I don't want to do that because that in your minds will think, well, we're shifting the long run AS. We're not shifting the long run AS curve, okay? Think about it in terms of this. Think about it in terms of machinery being asked to work at 110% capacity. Think of it in terms of the labor force working overtime, working above their 40-hour weeks, okay? So everybody's employed, everybody's working more than 40-hour weeks, everybody is kind of working on turbocharge, everybody's working above and beyond their 100% capacity. That's only sustainable for a short period of time. It's not sustainable in the long run, okay? What's gonna happen in the long run is the reverse of this. AD is increasing, which means the demand for goods and services increases, which means the demand for labor increases, which means that wages increase. It's kind of the opposite of what's gone on here. Demand is shifting outwards. And because wages are going up, costs of production are going up. And when costs of production are going up, we should shift the short-run aggregate supply curve to the left. And we have come back to YFE. So our direction of movement is now that, A, B, C. We've come back to point C in the long run because the movement in the aggregate supply curve, the short-run aggregate supply curve, has countered the effects of the AD. And although we are now at a higher price level, we have come back to YFE. So in the classical world, you can have a positive output gap, but only for a short period of time in the short run. In the long run, there is no such thing as an output gap. A positive output gap. So hopefully that's all made sense. And if it doesn't, rewind, have another look at it. But ultimately, in terms, what did we learn about output gaps? Negative, positive, Keynesian, classical. In the Keynesian world, you can have a negative output gap in the long run. It's acceptable. But in the Keynesian world, positive output gaps do not exist because you can never go past the PPF. You can never go past the vertical point of the Keynesian AS curve. In the classical world, you can have a negative output gap, but only in the short run. Okay, you can have a positive output gap, but again, only in the short run. So in the classical world, the key conclusion is there are no output gaps in the long run. Because remember, this classical idea is that if you are willing and able to work, there will be a job for you. You just need to adjust your wages to what businesses are willing to pay for you. And a classical economist says that if you're not, particularly, by the way, if we're talking about a recession here, a classical economist argues that if you don't have a job, well, that's on you. You need to get over yourself and you need to accept a wage decrease and work for less. Okay, if you're not prepared to work for less, then a classical economist doesn't believe that you're unemployed because they don't believe that you're willing and able to work. They don't see you as part of the labor force. Quite a lot of the time, classical economists are called unemployment deniers. Yeah, they deny that unemployment really exists because of this. Yeah, because classical economists are saying, well, there is always a job for you. You just need to adjust your wage expectations. You just need to accept a lower wage. Okay. Whereas in the Keynesian, what Keynes is saying, well, actually, that's not true. There is legislation that says that you can't accept a lower wage, but also it's just a kind of a rational expectation that people won't accept lower wages when it comes to negotiating their wages downwards. All right. And this is where those two schools of thought really just diverge completely. Keynes was willing to accept the classical story that actually you go into this negative output gap, fine. But he just didn't agree with the way that you come out of the negative output gap. In the classical world, the way you come out of the negative output gap is people accept lower wages. Keynes says, no way, people don't just accept lower wages. You need to artificially stimulate this economy out of their negative output gap. You do that with government intervention. But similarly, Keynes did accept the story of the positive output gap in the sense that the positive output gap always comes back to the vertical point. Okay, he doesn't bother with the idea that it only happens in the short run. It's like Keynes is kind of pointless. It's just like, well, you're going to end up there anyway. Okay, and this idea that we're working, it's happening straight away. People will negotiate their wages upwards very, very quickly. It's just the idea that they won't ever reduce their wages downwards. So those are the key fundamentals with output gaps. Output gaps exist in both, sort of. In Keynes, they can stick around. Negative output gaps can stick around in the long run, but there is no such thing as a positive output gap. In the classical world, they only ever occur in the short run. And that's it. Hopefully that answers some of your questions with regards to output gaps. Thanks very much for tuning in. See you next time.